Well, you probably are aware of this, but Australian workers are on the move. Mobility is one of the buzzwords to describe the Australian workforce at the moment. People moving from job to job, from career to career. 3 years and 4 months. That's the current average for how long we will spend in a particular job. 17 different employers we'll have over the course of our working life at present. That's an interesting little tidbit of information about the workforce in Australia today. But it raises for me a perhaps obvious question, which is why? And as you look through some of the surveys of why we're on the move, 2 key reasons come to the fore. One reason we're on the move is for career advancement, moving up the ladder. That reason is perhaps obvious enough. But there's a second reason that continues to appear in all those surveys, a reason that can perhaps best be described as, I can't stand the people that I work with. In one study published by job search website seek.com last year, it found that 22% of Australians, 1 in 5, say that they have changed jobs because of negative experiences at work. Namely, the website said, they couldn't stand the people that they worked with, their colleagues. 1 in 5 Australians have changed jobs for that reason. What do we do when we can't stand our colleagues? We move away from them. Now, our colleagues, they can be some of the best people in our lives. They, more than anyone else, understand the pressures, the challenges and the joys that is associated with our daily work, because they're in it with us. But you don't have to have been in any workplace for too long to realise that colleagues can be some of the most infuriating people in our lives as well. There's the lazy co-worker who takes credit for the work that you've done, the nightmare boss who blames you for all of his mistakes, the childish employee that you've got who seems to have never grown up, that infuriating client who's never satisfied with what you provide. Oftentimes it's the people that we interact with in our daily work that are the hardest part of our job. As one author says, to be happier, more successful and more stress-free at work, you only have to do 2 things well. You have to get the job done, and you have to handle the relationships with the people around you. Getting the job done tends to be the easy part. And so what do many of us do? Well, we move away. Of course, that moving away can happen long before we actually might leave a workplace, a distancing ourselves, a removing ourselves mentally and emotionally and even physically from the people that we don't like in our office, avoiding interacting with them as much as we possibly can, delaying on responding to their emails, or when we do, we keep it pretty short and sharp. Or if we're an employer, we just have those difficult people move to someone else's department. How do we often handle the pressure of toxic office relationships? We move ourselves away from those people. Or there's another thing that we do, in some ways the exact opposite. We move towards them and we attack them. We retaliate. We get even. There's an article online, 5 strategies to deal with the horrible co-worker, including this advice. Strategy number 3, don't get mad, get even. Lay future fantasy plans about ways to get even with your colleagues. If you bide your time, there may come a point when you can inflict massive and substantial damage to the work bully and seriously undermine their career. Revenge like this is unbelievably sweet. How do Australians handle toxic office relationships? We move away, or we move towards and attack. But I tell you, Jesus says, but I tell you, I have come to bring a different way, a better way, a way that is radical, it is countercultural, and it will be a way which is a profound witness to your colleagues. A way that does not move away, a way that does not move towards an attack, but a way that leans in towards them with love. But I tell you, Jesus says, chapter 6 of Luke, verse 27, I tell you who hear me, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who ill treat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. There are some who suggest that these are the most radical words that Jesus ever spoke. To lean in and love your enemies, to turn the other cheek towards them. Most of the commentators on these verses in the Bible agree that the idea of being struck on the cheek is more about insult than assault. To strike someone on the cheek was an act of insult in Jesus' time. Now, I'm hoping that you have never been physically assaulted in the office, in the workplace, but you perhaps know the experience of being insulted. The word, the snide remark which is made behind your back, which gets back to you nevertheless. Or a colleague who's always got something negative to say about everyone else, so you can only imagine what are they saying about me when I'm not around. Or hurtful and harmful words that are said in your presence, where your work is demeaned before others, or credit is never given for good work that you've done. Jesus says, how do we respond to that kind of insult that we might receive from colleagues? He says we turn the other cheek. The idea is that we don't walk away from the person who's insulted us. We don't retaliate and insult them in return. Both of which are acts of self-protection. Protecting myself, looking after myself, making sure I don't get hurt any further in this. But rather, Jesus says we're to lean in with love towards them, even making ourselves vulnerable. We lean in with our cheek towards them, Jesus says. Now, there are two things that you can do with a cheek. You can strike it, or you can kiss it. And that, Jesus says, is the key to difficult office relationships. To lean in with love means that you might actually get hit again. Or you might get kissed. And by that image, what I mean is that leaning in with love opens up the possibility to relationship with that person. Relationship that could never happen if self-protection was my focus, moving away from them or hitting them back. To turn the other cheek might mean you get hit again. But it could also be kissed. The writer Paul Tripp says we're to live in our relationships with a harvest mentality. And by that he says every day you harvest relational plants that have come from seeds of words and actions that you've planted in the past. You see, if we only ever plant self-protection with our colleagues, if that's all we're ever planting with our words and with our actions, then friendship, relationship with that person can never, ever grow. But turn the other cheek, and there is the possibility that friendship, relationship might even blossom. What might it mean to lean in with love to the difficult people in your office at your work? Well, it might mean making a beeline for their desk at the start of the day, the desk that you always want to avoid, you actually go directly to instead, lean in towards them, smile and ask a question about their day ahead at work. It might mean responding to the one who insults you or who failed to give you credit for work that you have done by doing the work and doing it well and asking if there's more that can be done. Opening yourself up to getting struck by them again. Or perhaps a warm response. One man that I know used to help himself to a handful of chocolates that his boss used to put in the kitchen once a week. He'd go in, grab a handful of chocolates, head to the desk of his colleague that he least liked, smile and just leave a pile of them there on the desk as a way of leaning in with love. Well, Jesus goes on and he gives further illustrations, examples in this passage of loving our enemy. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt. So another act of making yourself vulnerable, leaving yourself exposed, but also an act of generosity, doing some real good for that person that you least like. Now, what do we normally give to those people in the office that we don't like? Well, we give them the cold shoulder, we give them a roll of the eyes, a slanderous word out of their hearing, or if we're their boss, then we might give them the unpleasant work to do. We rarely give the people we don't like something which is actually good for them, that they might actually appreciate. Did you notice how many times that idea is mentioned in these few verses here? Verse 28, bless those who curse you. Verse 29, give them your coat. Verse 30, give to everyone who asks you. Verse 35, do good to them. We're to lean in with love and give some real, tangible good. Imagine today that you offered the most difficult colleague in your workplace who is just swamped with work at the moment a hand. Or gave that childish employee a positive word about the things that they do which actually are good and helpful around the place. Or you offered to that client who's never satisfied something a little extra. Real good which is costly, possibly leaving you exposed, vulnerable, without a coat. I once had a colleague that others in the office described as a seagull. You know, they turn up at the office, they flap their wings, they eat all the good stuff and then leave a mess in their wake. And it was very tempting to treat this colleague with disdain. And I confess, sometimes when they were out of earshot, I would join in the mocking of this person behind their back, the disdain that was directed towards them. But in rare, occasional good moments, I realised I can't be like this to the person in the office that everyone despises. What does it mean to lean in with love and turn the other cheek and do some real good? What it meant for this person was helping them with the work that they were swamped with, because often they were a bit overwhelmed by work. They weren't particularly good of it, which was part of the frustration that colleagues had with them. And so on the rare occasion, and it might mean staying back a little bit later, eating into my evening or others' evenings so that I could help them with the work that they were overwhelmed by. And I confess, times even when I did that, I still might have resented it. But we are to turn the other cheek, to do real good. If anyone takes what belongs to you, your evening at home, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Well, the final example that Jesus gives in here of how we're to lean in with love towards our enemies, in verse 28, he says, pray for those who mistreat you. I wonder if you've ever tried praying for that infuriating colleague before. Because if you have, you'll know something happens to you. It becomes very difficult to remain infuriated with someone who you were praying for. I continue to be surprised, although I shouldn't be, the impact that it has on my feelings towards someone I dislike when I pray for them. I can't help but feel more positively towards them. And praying for them is another way in which we actually do a real good for them as we lift them up before the Lord of the heaven and the earth. So think of that one difficult colleague right now, the one that infuriates you the most. Why don't you resolve as you walk from this breakfast to your office this morning to pray particularly for them? Because to pray for your enemies, to do genuine good towards them, to turn the other cheek, that is radical behaviour. It really is. I don't doubt that there are lots of acts of love going on in your office every day of the week. My colleagues who didn't follow Jesus nevertheless could do wonderfully loving things for one another. But to love your enemy, to love the colleague that you don't like, well, that is radical. Verse 32, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. As one writer says, to return evil for evil is normal, it is human. To return good for good is normal, it is human. To return evil for good is devilish, but to return good in the face of evil, that is the way of godliness. And it's a way that is a profound witness. The author, Eric Metaxas, says, love for enemies is the real difference between dead religion and a living faith in the God of the Scriptures. It's the difference between the religious ones who literally cross to the other side of the street, move away when they encounter a bloody and beaten traveller on the side of the road in Luke 10, and the Good Samaritan who crosses over and leans in with love. The difference between dead religion and a living faith in the God of the Scriptures. And it's the difference that is displayed to us most profoundly, most extravagantly in the Lord Jesus Christ, isn't it? So how does the God of the universe respond to you, to me, his difficult, wayward, infuriating creatures? Does he move away and ignore us? Does he move towards us and attack us? Or does he lean in, literally enter in to his very creation? And as he makes his way to the cross, he turns the other cheek and it is struck. And as he makes his way to the cross, he is stripped not just of his coat, but stripped completely naked. And as he's on the cross, does he condemn his enemies? No, he prays for them. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And there on the cross, he gives us real, tangible good for his enemies, those opposed to us. He gives his life so that we might receive the best thing, life abundant in him and life forever. In his book, The Peacemaker, Ken Sand tells the following story. I'll close with this. Ted is a new Christian, works for a government agency, and has always had a difficult relationship with his immediate supervisor, Joan. So Ted has a bad back, some back problems, and Joan's aware of that, and yet she still seems to give him tasks, responsibilities that only exacerbate the problem. Well, one day, undergoing these duties, Ted injures his back and has several months off work, injured. And during that time, he files a lawsuit against Joan, his supervisor. Talk about toxic office relationships. However, during this process of the lawsuit, he meets with a Christian and begins to discuss with him about what's going on. So now Ted's a new Christian, and this older Christian begins to ask him some questions about his involvement in the relationship with Joan. And Ted comes to the realisation that, you know what, Joan is not exclusively to blame in this whole scenario, that actually I have to carry some of the blame and the responsibility of this difficult relationship. And that's something we haven't particularly unpacked this morning, that how often many times we need to look at ourselves too, and the part that we play in those difficult relationships. But nevertheless, Ted realises this about himself and his relationship with Joan, and so what he decides to do is drop the lawsuit as a demonstration of God's mercy that has been shown towards him. So he goes in, arranges a meeting with his supervisor Joan, and tells her that he had been arrogant and rude, and he asks her for forgiveness. Asking a colleague for their forgiveness. Radical. And he explains to her that his Christian faith is the motivation for what he's doing, dropping the lawsuit. Well, Joan is suspicious. She grudgingly responds, well, let bygones be bygones. And let's leave it at that. Sand writes, although Joan's response wasn't quite what Ted had hoped for, he walked out of her office knowing that God had forgiven him and that he had at least given Joan a glimpse of that forgiveness. But Ted soon discovered that Joan was telling others about their meeting. The next day, a union rep who had heartily supported the lawsuit against Joan confronted Ted and asked whether he'd really dropped his lawsuit. When Ted said yes, the man asked, is it true that you did it because you're a Christian? Ted again said yes, and the man's scowl turned to a look of puzzlement. As the man walked away, Ted heard him say to a bystander, well, that's the first time I've ever seen a Christian's faith cost him anything. Like ripples in a pond, word of Ted's actions spread throughout the department. For the first time since Ted's conversion, he felt he was really helping people to learn about what God's love is like. Friends, that is the power of leaning in with love. Like the one who entered in and lent in with love towards you. So as Jesus says, be merciful therefore, as your heavenly Father is merciful. Amen.